Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. To ask a question during the question and answer session, please press star 1. Today's conference is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I will now turn the call over to Ms. Patty Terry. Ma'am, you may begin.
Hi, everyone. My name is Patty Terry, and I am with the Verizon Foundation. I would like to welcome you to today's special webinar that features Dr. Kathy Swan, who is part of the creation team and architect of the C3 College Career and Civil Life Framework. She's going to be here with us today to share the impact of this incredible work on the changing landscape of social studies education. We're very happy that she could be with us. She is also a fellow with the National Museum of American History, and we are so honored to have her with us. Please keep your questions for the end of the session, and we will be glad to address them at that time. And thank you for attending today's webinar. Kathy?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Verizon, for the Smithsonian, for hosting me this past fall. I've had a lot of great experiences as a teacher and now as a teacher educator, particularly with my new life as kind of shepherding the C3 framework project forward. But probably one of my favorite experiences of my life has been to be the senior fellow at the American History Museum this fall. There's nothing like emerging from the Smithsonian Metro stop up the escalator onto the National Mall with the Washington Monument to your left and the Capitol building to your right, and that you know you get to traverse that mall to this amazing seminal spot in the world called the National American History Museum. So I come to you today after having returned from my last week as a fellow at the Smithsonian, kind of in the glow of what an amazing semester I had, just really being in the presence of greatness there. So all of that is to say that I'm very thankful for that experience. I felt a little bit like somebody had to pinch me most days being there. So that's, I will stop going on about that. I said in a meeting just a little while ago, does anybody feel like they've been on a spa vacation this past week? And I was trying to be a little bit tongue-in-cheek about what this time of year is like. It's awfully stressful for everyone involved in teaching, involved in living. And so I know that everyone who is joining us today has probably had a long day and maybe wants me to get to the point. So the point of today's session is to talk a little bit about this document called the College Career Civic Life Framework. We, for short, call it the C3 framework, and we think it has the real potential for engaging teachers, policymakers, teacher educators, curriculum experts, district, states, and hopefully the nation in a conversation about the ways in which social studies prepares students not just for college and career, but its most important mission, which is to educate our youngest citizens about their civic responsibilities. And so this is a project that's been 3 years in the making. It was published appropriately this past September on Constitution Day. You might have heard some fireworks going off somewhere in D.C. and across the nation. And it was the sound of the writers actually rejoicing that we actually went to print. And so Carrie asked me to talk a little bit about this document, what it means for the field, what it means for classroom teachers, and where do we go now that, so I often ask the question, if we build it, will they come? So we've built this document, and we're hoping that it makes an impact at the classroom level, at the school level, the district, as well as the state level. So that's what I hope to do today is paint a picture of that. So I called it Achieving the C3, an exploration into 21st century social studies. So I'll start out by talking about, I like talking about embarrassing moments. It's always a good way. Self-deprecating humor is a good way to begin any, I think, presentation. And so I had one of those moments just a few weeks ago. My dean here at the college hosted an innovation summit, which focused on, yes, of course, STEM education. And she had asked me back in the summer to do a session for a variety of educators, both classroom teachers as well as administrators, as well as policymakers, that had come together on these couple of days to talk about innovation in STEM education. And she asked me if I would be willing to do a session on the C3. And so, you know, I didn't really want to do it, to be honest. I felt like, oh, here we go. This is the personification of the marginalization of social studies. Here we have this innovation conference around social studies around STEM education, and nobody's going to come to my session. I'm going to put all this work because nobody cares about social studies. So I felt like a little bit like an elephant in a room. And I initially said no, and then she tried through email to get me to say yes, and I kind of politely said, oh, you don't need me to do this. Really, it's okay. And then ultimately she called my cell phone, and so I said, jump, how high? I'd be happy to present at this conference. And so it challenged me once I said yes to think, well, how do I make social studies meaningful to STEM educators? And so I'll start with just a statement that my husband's one of those STEM educators, so I like poking fun at the STEM disciplines. So I will try and keep that to a minimum, but you'll know that I come from a place of love when I do it. So in any case, I was asked to kind of situate this C3 framework in the midst of this kind of innovative STEM conference. And so it occurred to me that what I probably needed to do was, before I even got in to this document that they likely didn't even really care about, that I needed to start with the question of what is social studies? Because honestly, how many people really know what social studies is? Even as social studies educators, we struggle with that question. And so one of my colleagues here at the University of Kentucky, her name is Linda Lepstick. She's very famous in teaching history. She wrote the book called Doing History. And she's like a lot of really unbelievably smart people, that they're able to encapsulate things in very simply elegant ways. And so she's definitely one of these people that can do that, and I kind of stand in awe. She came into my class a few weeks ago, my methods class, and really defined social studies for the students. I had spent a semester doing what she did in about 5 minutes in much more elegant ways. And she essentially said, you know, in social studies, we do two things. We explore the question, what does it mean to be human? And then the other question is, what does it mean to be humane? That these are kind of the two questions that ultimately we answer as a result of a robust social studies education, and that we want students to explore in K-12 classrooms. And that in order to explore these two questions, that we use these disciplinary perspectives, what I like to call lenses, on human issues, events, and ideas, which is, you know, the political lens, the economic, the geographic, and the historical perspectives or habits of mind in order to get at this question, these questions, what does it mean to be human and what does it mean to be humane? And then we attempt to apply what we have learned in some kind of meaningful way. That's the civic piece of it, right? Is this, what does it mean to be humane? We think about that this learning isn't just for learning's sake. It's for a purpose. It's for a civic outcome. And so social studies is all about these civic outcomes of these academic inquiries. And so I like to rib my husband that we add meaning and purpose to what I call the inhumanities if we're the humanities, then we kind of help to encapsulate or nestle the inhumanities within some kind of meaning and purpose, which he totally appreciates, by the way. So I figured that kind of pontification wasn't really useful to science, math educators, that they wanted to see what I really meant. And so I said, well, take, for instance, the innovation of hybrid technologies. What do we do in the social studies? So you in the hard sciences create these innovations, these technological innovations in society. So what do we do in social studies to try and make meaning of them? Well, we ask questions. We ask disciplinary questions. So political questions might be, should government assist corporations in developing hybrid technologies? In economics, we might ask, how do we create a tax environment to spur this innovation? In geography, we might ask, where does this technology find the most, quote, wiggle room? Is it in rural, urban, or suburban communities? Is there kind of a gendered kind of foundation for who buys Priuses or hybrid technologies? And then in history, we might ask what innovations in the past created social, political, economic change. Is there a chain abattoir? And so my friend Linda works in archaeology a bit. Linda Lestick, she kind of hybrids into archaeology, and she uses this term with fourth graders, chain abattoir. And she says they just love it because they sound very French, and it sounds really important. And it is important. It's the notion that innovations aren't birthed from nothing, that they're built on a series of innovations, so that in order to create the Prius, you could track back that innovation all the way back to the wheel, for instance. And so that chain abattoir becomes a historical question that we ask in the social studies. But that's really not enough. We ask disciplined questions, certainly. But as I said before, we have this what does it mean to be humane question that kind of situates itself in social studies, where we ask questions like, do hybrid technologies enhance the common good? Can and should we do something about them? So we not only kind of put patches in our sleeves and ask these very important academic questions, but then we also ask what should we do about them. And we engage students in this kind of civic act of connecting kind of these academic inquiries into the community in some kind of meaningful way. So I think I had them at that point, but wait, there was more. I handed out a picture on the next slide of the human toilet. And I said, I asked them to generate a series of questions, disciplinary questions, and these kind of civic questions we ask about modern day toilets. And you should have seen them try to come up with the chain abattoir, and then to really think about what is human and both humane about the toilet, which was great. I have a 7-year-old, so poop jokes kill at my house, so I tend to use those quite frequently in order to engage audiences, because I'm usually engaging my 7-year-old in those kinds of conversations. And then I moved them to something that I think has strong ethical dimensions, which is, you can see on the slide here, Fat Man and Little Boy, the atomic bombs that were dropped in Japan at the conclusion of World War II. And so we take these kinds of innovations from the hard sciences and we ask tough questions. And that's what we do in social studies. So I say all of that because I think it's a pretty good illustration of what it is we were trying to do in this document called the C3 framework. And so I don't forget saying this, you can go to the National Council for the Social Studies website, ncss.org, and you can click on the C3 framework and you can download what I call 130 pages of awesome for free. It's freely available on the website, and I hope that you print it out in color. We spent a lot of time thinking about color and the way in which we wanted to present social studies and in particular the framework in really colorful and innovative ways. So I think you can lay this aside any standards document, and I think it's pretty impressive. In any case, I tried to do that exercise as a window into what we were trying to accomplish in this C3 framework. And, you know, I have to say, while I functioned as the project director and lead writer, there were 17 other writers on the team, and it was very much a collaborative effort. And so when I talk about the C3, I certainly feel like I had something to do with it, but know that it was really written by a team of social studies educators, a team of 17 academics, and then on top of that, 15 professional organizations who weighed in, 23 states and 50 teachers and a variety of curricular partners, including the Smithsonian, who kind of weighed in on this document. And then ultimately we sent it out to our social studies community so that if you're part of NCSS, you had a chance to review it. And so I say that because it was not written in a smoke-filled room, but a marketplace of ideas that was honed over several years to a place where we tried to simply elegantly try to capture what is social studies. Those two questions that I presented, the kind of human versus humane questions in 137 pages of awesome. And we did that by creating three kind of pillars that provide the backbone of the document. The first is what we call the inquiry arc. The second is disciplinary literacy, and the third is this very important outcome of all education, but in social studies, particularly civic life. So what I thought we would do today on this call is talk about those three pillars and the way in which they're represented in the document. So the first is the inquiry arc. We've worked on this graphic. One thing that I've learned, the miseducation of Kathy Swan, one of the things that I have been educated about is how hard it is to capture kind of a dynamic idea in a graphic. This is as close as we got. I actually really like it. But what this graphic tries to capture is this arc of learning and knowing in the social studies. And what we tried to capture in static form is that below the surface of questioning, knowing, analyzing, and communicating, below that kind of clean surface is this effervescent, messy process. And so you kind of see these roots taking hold in the soil. And while it may look neat, we all know that working in classrooms and working around inquiry is messy. And so part of this graphic is trying to capture that notion of inquiry. So the inquiry arc. So the inquiry arc is built around what we call 4 dimensions. And let me also say that I have a colleague who when we started this project, he gave our project a 30% chance of success. So we were really lucky. I got to be fairly self-righteous when I talked to him a few weeks ago that we were successful. And then his other caveat was that if we were successful, wouldn't it be great if a set of standards could essentially fit on a bookmark? And so I think we went 2 for 2 on that. We created these dimensions that essentially provide the anchors to the inquiry arc. And I've used the term backbone before, but essentially these are a backbone to the inquiry arc, where students begin with a question. They apply disciplinary tools and concepts, so civics, economics, geography, and history, that they evaluate sources and use evidence, and that they communicate their conclusions and take informed action, which I'll talk a little bit about in a while. The one thing that I'll say, I think that, just speaking of this theme, innovation, in some ways, I think that this document codifies what we know to be true about social studies. And in that way isn't innovative. I mean, inquiry isn't new. Disciplinary perspective's not new. There are teachers that are doing this a lot in schools, and for good purpose. That's a vernacular. Evaluating sources and using evidence is kind of a vernacular that we speak about best practices in social studies and the highest form of outcomes. What I will say, though, is that I think in the codification of inquiry, it's innovative. And I think where we got really innovative is in Dimension 1. So I'll take a minute just to talk about that. So Dimension 1 is all about questions. We talk a lot in education about inquiry, but not so much where inquiries originate. As we know, they begin with some gnawing question that sends us in search of some answers. In the C3, we call these questions compelling or supporting. The compelling questions, though, are those thorny questions that kind of get under our skin and propel an inquiry forward. And we give some examples of that in the framework. Was the American Revolution really revolutionary? Why do we have rules? How bad was the Great Recession? So I think we're pretty happy with the way in which we took questioning seriously in Dimension 1 and tried to put some language around the types of questions we want students to be asking and thinking about, and then to give some criteria for those questions. So in essence, we created criteria that are kind of grade band appropriate, but kind of revolve around two criteria. The one is that compelling questions have to be kid-friendly. They're different than essential questions in that way, although I'm sure I will beg an argument for someone that would say that essential questions are kid-friendly. In my experience, and I think in the experience of the writers, essential questions tend to be developed for the purpose of kind of framing curriculum. They're not necessarily the questions that get under kids' skins. And so one of the things we wanted to do in the C3 framework is really think about the ways in which students have agency within an inquiry. So students participate within an inquiry. It's not done to them. Inquiry isn't done to them, but that they have a voice. And part of that voice is having a space to create their own questions and for teachers to go out of their way to create a space in which their questions are shared with students. And so we created this kind of criteria that says, A, they need to be kid-friendly, but B, they need to be intellectually meaty, that they need to appeal to these kind of enduring issues in social studies. So I think if somebody asked me kind of what was my most proud, kind of the part that I'm kind of most proud of in the C3 framework, and the thing that I'm most scared of, it would probably be Dimension 1. And that I think we were fairly innovative and frontier-like. On the other hand, I think that there's a lot of space for figuring out what these kinds of student-created or co-created questions look like in the classroom, and the way in which they're sustained within any particular inquiry. So obviously you can read the document and think about Dimension 2 probably looks most like what standards documents look like right now, which is, around the disciplines. What I think we do well in Dimension 2 is we try to lay these disciplines alongside one another and try and explain what those habits of mind that are unique to those disciplines and how they might be used within an inquiry. So that's Dimension 2. Dimension 3 probably mostly parallels the Common Core efforts in English language arts to have students use informational text and primary sources to build towards an argument or an explanation. And so I was explaining to one organization that I'm working with recently that if ultimately in Dimension 4 you want students to write an argument or talk an argument or discuss an argument or an explanation, Dimension 1 helps frame that argument, initiate an argument or an explanation, and Dimension 3 really helps students work with the evidence in order to make a valid argument or explanation. So you'll see in the framework we really spend a lot of time trying to make these connections to the Common Core, and Dimension 3 probably most closely parallels the Common Core, but also kind of opens it up to not just be history/social science, but really be a social studies approach in which we are paying kind of equal time to what we think are the 4 core disciplines in the social studies: civics, economics, geography, and history. Dimension 4 is about the multiple ways in which students can communicate their conclusions to an inquiry, whether that be in multimodal function. I just wrote a book on documentary making. That's certainly a valid way to communicate an argument, as well as writing, as well as debate. We know all the ways in which we make our classrooms come alive with communicating conclusions. I'll talk a little bit later about taking informed action, but I think it's important to note that we ended the inquiry with this opportunity for students to make meaning in their community, whether that be their classroom community, school community, or community outside the school. They have opportunities to make those connections. So not that every inquiry ends in some kind of action piece, but that students have an opportunity within their K-12 experience, within the year of their K-12 experience, to participate inside or outside of their classroom, applying what they've learned. So the framework is organized, as I said, within 4 dimensions, and then from there, there's various subsections. So there's a method to our madness. Within Dimension 2, there's a fairly unique structure in which we have, as I said, the disciplines laying aside one another, and the big ideas of those disciplines helping to anchor that subsection. So, for instance, in history, there are 4 subsections: change, continuity, and context, perspective, historical sources and evidence, causation, and argumentation, which helps to frame the purposes of or the perspective of history. And then if you drill down even further, you'll get to what we call pathways. And these pathways are, in a sense, a sort of progression in grade band fashion, where students, by the end of their high school experience, should be able to be fairly proficient in these discrete indicators. So that's the first pillar of the C3 framework, is this foundation and inquiry. The second pillar of the framework was the Common Core, making clear and important connections to the Common Core in multiple ways. And I'll start by just saying that we believe that we have a shared responsibility for literacy, but we like to think about that shared responsibility as literacy for a social studies purpose. And so in the document, as you'll read, we have graphical and narrative explanations that are woven throughout, not as an appendix, but kind of part of the fabric of the document. We're fully aligned to the Common Core anchor standards, and we kind of make these distinctions around those anchor standards that are foundational, supportive, and vital. We go out of our way to make the shared language between the 2 documents, so making sure that we use the term argumentation, evidence, sources, discourse, etc. And this was particularly important for our elementary brethren who are struggling to make sense of these multiple documents that they need to teach to. And so we wanted to make sure that this was as accessible as possible. In the new social education, my colleague John Lee and I he was another writer, wrote an article about what we call the C3 literacies. And so it was our attempt to take a stab at really further articulating the notion of disciplinary literacy. And so in that article, we tried to marry two but related literacies that we talk about in the C3, inquiry literacies and those that are disciplinary specific. So you can see on this slide, trying to kind of articulate, well, there are literacies within the social studies, and you can kind of bifurcate them in some ways into these inquiry literacies and those that reside within the discipline. And the framework tries to get at those in pretty explicit ways. The last pillar of the document is around civic engagement. And I have to say, again, this is probably one of our most proud moments in the framework, one of our biggest victories. And I'll quote, and I'll do a little name dropping right now, Mira Levinson, my colleague from Harvard. I like saying that. It makes me feel really smart. She talks about not only is there an inquiry arc, but there's this civic arc happening in the document, so that the mere asking of questions is a civic act. Knowing things is a civic act. Marshaling evidence is a civic act. Communicating conclusions is a civic act. So inquiry in and of itself is civic, is teaching students about civic engagement. We also work to incorporate other ways of thinking about the way in which we cultivate the civic life of our youngest citizens. So in the document, we thread throughout this notion of civil and democratic discourse within diverse and collaborative contexts. So you'll notice that every STEM for an indicator starts with individually and with others, students will. So trying to signal that this is not done just individually, but within a collaborative environment. And then within certain standards, particularly the civic standards, the civics writers really talk specifically about the way in which we need to teach students how to use deliberative processes in order to come to conclusions. And then lastly, our big triumphant moment around taking informed action, in which we want students to do something with the knowledge that they've gained. So not only is what it means to be human, but that you spend time thinking about what it means to be humane and participating in your community in some kind of meaningful way. So I'll shift gears a little bit here and just say, so what can the C3 do for you? So great document. I would say the greatest document ever written, but I'm fairly partial to it. And so the next question means, well, is this going to be elf on the shelf? Is it going to be just something that sits and kind of makes us behave in certain settings? Or is this something that's going to impact our life beyond kind of this initial period of excitement? And so we think that it has great potential. We're working with a number of states right now that are using it as a foundation for their new standards. So Connecticut and Kentucky are leading the way. There are other states that are using it as a companion to their existing standards. So Maryland, North Carolina, Kansas, New York are all states that are, Hawaii, are all states that are talking about using this document to sit atop, aside, beneath as a foundation for their existing state standards. I think we have a great opportunity in this document to recalibrate our current relationship with the literacy movement. As much as I believe we share in the responsibility of literacy, we've certainly taken a deep dive into literacy education, and in particular in the elementary classroom. And so I think that the C3 has an opportunity to explain to our ELA colleagues the way in which we approach literacy in the social studies classroom, so that we don't end up getting reduced to word walls and decoding of primary sources, but that we're able to spend time asking why. Why are we reading this source? Why is it important? Is it historically significant? We can ask questions of corroboration, perspective, all of the things that social studies teachers think are sexy in our classroom. So I think it has great potential for that. Many districts right now and states are contacting us about using the framework as the foundation for professional learning for both in-service and pre-service teachers. My good colleague, S.G. Grant, wrote an article in the special issue of Social Ed that talked about the instructional arc. So not only is there an inquiry arc, a civic arc, but there's an instructional arc. So somebody said to me the other week, it sounds like my methods class. And I said, good. It should sound like your methods class. There's a place where student outcomes should meet pedagogy. And if you don't read the pedagogical undertones within the document, you're certainly not paying attention. New outcomes require new ways of teaching our students. So with that comes all sorts of potential around curriculum and instruction, which I'll kind of tailor my final remarks around. And then there's the golden chest of assessment reform. And so I have an all-day meeting tomorrow that starts early about the ways in which the C3 might impact classroom assessment, and then certainly the holy grail is statewide assessment. And then at the very least, I think it's our Jerry Maguire moment, right? If you remember that movie where he stayed up all night and wrote, and I've been told not to call it a manifesto, so I'm going to stay away from that, but certainly call it a mission statement about what it is we try and do in the social studies classroom as a bridge to policymakers of why is social studies important. So those are some of the ways in which we think the document can operate. I'll kind of talk just briefly about a new project that I'm working on out of NCSS, and that is a curricular project that's going to be a book, a bulletin that will be available by next year's conference, the NCSS conference. And we've invited 20 of our curriculum partners to the project. So the Smithsonian American History Museum is on the marquee, Library of Congress Museum, the National Constitution Center, Bill of Rights, National Geographic, National History Day, Gilder Lehrman. It's a lineup, Colonial Williamsburg, Ford's Theater. So we're working with professional curricular writers that are at the top of their game to really think about the ways in which the C3 plays out instructionally. So each of them are taking the C3 on at a grade level and content and creating a lesson, a narrative lesson on what the C3 looks like from their organizational perspective. And I, as editor, my colleague John Lee and I, as editors, are learning some important lessons. We thought about calling it, and I'll start with that lesson, that we thought about calling it the C3 remix, that essentially we're asking these organizations to remix their content around the inquiry arc. And we found that that's wrong as we've gotten into the project, that essentially we haven't been doing inquiry all along. We've done parts of inquiry. Some organizations, for instance, like Gilder Lehrman, are fantastic at Dimension 2 and Dimension 3. Other organizations, like the Center for Civic Education or Civic Action, are absolutely wonderful at Dimension 4, but may need to shift their practice around Dimension 1. And so we've been playing with this title shift of C3, the C3 shift. So I say that because I'm going to get to a point, or we'll call it something else. So what we've learned so far is that curricular partners have strengths and weaknesses, and my guest teachers have strengths and weaknesses when it comes to the instructional arc. I found as I approached my methods class this fall that as I had my kind of come to Kathy moment, that I don't do a lot of action in my classroom as I prepare students for teaching. And so I've had to rethink that. I've had to think about creating a space for student questioning in my classroom. And so I'd like to think of these as not kind of an extreme makeover. I'm not getting an extreme makeover. I'm hoping that other teachers aren't getting an extreme makeover, but really that we're shifting instruction. And just even most recently, I was on a call last week, and somebody even suggested that we might call these continuities and shifts. so that it's affirming, and I'm sure to all the teachers on the call right now, that this isn't novel to you. There may be places in the inquiry arc or in the C3 that you could reflect and say, I could grow, but some of these are continuities or an affirmation or a codification about what we know to be good practice in social studies. And so what we're trying to do in the book is really help shape a nuanced thinking about reform. And so we've been playing around with what we're calling the instructional shifts. These have changed drastically even from last week, but you can see, one of them being social studies is driven by inquiry and framed by questions, preferably student questions, and so forth. So really trying to move our discussions forward to what we think is an important classroom conversations. And I'll end kind of with a big finish. I see it's almost a quarter of. And I want to leave some time for questions. But the teachers are ready to shift. I got this email a couple months or about a month ago, and it was from this teacher who had kind of low expectations about what the C3 framework was going to do. And he wrote, I've been worried that the new framework, the standards, would be either low quality or ambiguous. I mean, we've come to have low expectations in social studies, haven't we? And he goes on to write that it's so amazing what we focus on. It gives me so much hope for this country that if our citizens can do what we talk about in the C3 framework, that we might be able to solve many of our national ills and address our global challenges. So that, I love getting emails like that if you feel like writing. This time of year, I don't really like getting negative emails, so you might want to hold on till I have a fresh perspective in the new year. Please feel free to write me nice emails at least until December 31st. So I guess I'll end with just an official invitation to those on the webinar and those who might want to engage in the C3 work. That you might think about examining your own strengths and weaknesses and begin experimenting, leading from the classroom. That when you have the opportunities that you might push for more rigorous, authentic assessments that maybe align more to kind of the practice and habits of mind we're trying to cultivate in the framework, that you be a leader in your school and your PLC. I love getting emails from department chairs and teachers who are expressing their own informed action by making this a conversation piece in their district, in their classroom, in their school. And that maybe you might even take an administrator for a cup of coffee and bring them a free color copy of the C3 framework for he or she to peruse and think about a well-rounded K-12 education and the importance of social studies. And then lastly, I would encourage you to sign up for this new project that I've got going on called c3teachers.org. It's up and running. John Lee from the great state of North Carolina, he's an associate professor there at NC State, and I are working with a group of teachers, teacher bloggers, because we believe that teachers need to be in front of this work, that it doesn't need to be college professors, that we need to see the way in which teachers work this out in the classroom. So c3teachers.org is going to be a hub for those conversations between and among teachers, and a place where we might be able to disseminate some of the important work that is coming about because of what we think is going to be a game changer in social studies, the framework. So I'll stop there because I know I want to answer any of your questions if you have any.
Thank you. At this time, if you would like to ask a question, please press star 1, unmute your line, and record your name. To withdraw your question, press star 2. Again, if you would like to ask a question, please press star 1 and record your name. One moment, please. Showing no phone questions at this time.
It looks like there are no questions. And Kathy, I want to tell you, on behalf of all of us who have attended this webinar this afternoon, this has been a wonderful introduction to all of us to the C3 project. It's kind of exciting. We're so grateful for having had the opportunity to learn from one of the founding mothers because it's incredible how you've taken such a huge body of work and you have prepared a presentation here that has made it very clear and very exciting. I hope I speak for everyone when I say I'm certainly looking forward to going out there to the website and downloading my 130 pages of awesome.
Well, I always say don't read it too close to bedtime. You'll be up all night. It's like a good double cappuccino, double espresso cappuccino. So thank you.
Your enthusiasm and your passion for social studies and for this project comes through loud and clear, and I think that every one of us who has had the opportunity to be with you this afternoon has greatly grown and greatly benefited from this. We thank you for your invitation to connect with you through c3teachers.org, and we will definitely look forward to more exciting work from you. And Carrie Cacho at Smithsonian, thank you so much for bringing Kathy Swan to our attention and allowing us to showcase her here with the ThinkFinity Foundation. On behalf of us all here at ThinkFinity, we thank you for your time this afternoon, for attending, and hope that you have enjoyed this webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you for participating in today's conference. Please disconnect your lines at this time.